By the summer of 1942, the United States Army Air Forces had a severe mathematical problem flying over the warm waters of Florida. The problem was not the German Luftwaffe or the Japanese Imperial Navy. The problem was a machine built by the Glenn L. Martin Company. It was designated the B-26 Marauder, a twin-engine medium bomber. The engineers who designed it called it a technological marvel. The young pilots training to fly it at MacDill Field in Tampa, Florida, had a different name for it. They called it the Widowmaker. They also called it the Flying Prostitute, a bitter joke reflecting the fact that the plane had no visible means of support. To understand why the B-26 was killing so many of its own pilots in training, you have to look at the ruthless geometry of its design. In 1939, the military demanded a medium bomber that could fly incredibly fast, at least 300 miles per hour. To achieve that speed, Martin's engineers made a radical decision. They gave the aircraft two massive, powerful Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engines. And to reduce aerodynamic drag, they gave the plane abnormally short, stubby wings. The wingspan was only 65 feet. When fully loaded with fuel and bombs, the B-26 weighed a staggering 34,000 pounds. This created an aerodynamic reality known as wing loading. It is a simple equation: the weight of the aircraft divided by the square footage of the wings. The B-26 had the highest wing loading of any aircraft accepted by the Army up to that point. Because the wings were so incredibly small relative to the massive weight of the fuselage, the aircraft had to fly extremely fast simply to stay in the air. For the pilots, this translated into absolute terror during takeoff and landing. A standard aircraft of the era, like the B-25 Mitchell, could safely approach a runway at roughly 80 or 90 miles per hour. The B-26 Widowmaker required an approach speed of 130 to 140 miles per hour. At that speed, the heavy aircraft handled like a falling brick. If a pilot miscalculated his approach angle by a few degrees, or if he pulled the throttles back a split second too early, the short wings would abruptly lose their aerodynamic lift. The plane would instantly drop out of the sky. MacDill Field became a slaughterhouse. The Army was rushing young, inexperienced pilots through the training program. Many of them had only a few hundred hours of flight time in slow, forgiving training planes before being strapped into the seat of the B-26. The transition was lethal. When an engine sputtered on takeoff, or when a young pilot flared too high on landing, the heavy bomber snapped into an unrecoverable spin and slammed into the ground or the water. The catastrophic crashes became a daily occurrence. Black smoke constantly rose over the Florida coast. A bleak, horrified rhyme began to circulate through the barracks and mess halls of the training bases. One a day in Tampa Bay. By late 1942, the situation had escalated from a tragic training hazard to a full-blown military crisis. Fear fundamentally destroyed the morale of the bomber groups. Pilots were terrified of their own aircraft. They actively began to refuse to fly. It was an unspoken, decentralized mutiny. Young officers were intentionally failing check rides or requesting transfers to the infantry, anything to avoid climbing back into the cockpit of the Widowmaker. The crisis reached the highest levels of the United States government. Senator Harry Truman's special committee investigating the National Defense Program launched a formal inquiry into the B-26. Politicians and high-ranking generals looked at the horrific crash statistics from Florida and reached a stark conclusion. The Martin B-26 was an unforgivable engineering failure. The official recommendation was drafted: immediately halt all production of the aircraft, dismantle the existing bombers, and scrap the entire project to save the lives of American airmen. Tens of millions of dollars would be thrown into the garbage. The leadership of the Army Air Forces had one final desperate card to play before destroying the fleet. They called upon Major General Jimmy Doolittle. Doolittle was not a desk general. He was a legendary aviator, an aeronautical engineer with a doctorate from MIT, and the man who had led the famous impossible bombing raid over Tokyo. He understood the complex mathematics of aerodynamics, but more importantly, he understood the psychology of terrified pilots. Doolittle arrived at MacDill Field not to issue orders, but to prove a point. The base was tense. The young crews watched as the famous general walked out to the flight line and climbed into the cockpit of a fully loaded B-26 Marauder. He did not ask for a specially prepared aircraft. He took a standard bomber straight off the line. Doolittle started the two massive radial engines, taxied to the end of the runway, and pushed the throttles strictly to maximum power. The heavy bomber roared down the tarmac and lifted heavily into the hot Florida sky. What Doolittle did next intentionally violated every safety protocol written in the Army Air Force's manual. While still at low altitude, climbing away from the runway at severe speed, Doolittle intentionally reached forward and killed his right engine. He completely feathered the propeller, stopping it from spinning. On the ground, the young pilot stopped breathing. An engine failure on takeoff in a B-26 was universally understood to be an instant death sentence. The asymmetric thrust of the single remaining engine, combined with the heavy weight and the tiny wings, violently threw the aircraft sideways into a fatal spin. But Doolittle did not spin. He knew exactly what the machine was capable of if flown with absolute mathematical precision. He applied immediate, brutal pressure to the rudder pedals to counteract the asymmetric thrust. He kept the aircraft's nose perfectly pitched to maintain the critical speed of 140 miles per hour over the tiny wings. To the absolute shock of the men on the ground, Doolittle did not just stabilize the crippled bomber. He flew it aggressively. He threw the heavy, single-engine B-26 into steep banking turns. He flew low passes over the field, proving that the aircraft could not only survive a catastrophic engine failure, but could maneuver violently while doing so. Finally, he brought the massive plane around and executed a perfect, high-speed landing on the runway, using only half his power. When Doolittle climbed out of the cockpit, he delivered a cold, analytical message to the panicked training base. He told them the B-26 was not a trainer. It was an advanced tactical weapon. It was completely unforgiving of mistakes, and it would kill anyone who failed to respect its required speeds. But he insisted, if flown strictly by the numbers, it would do exactly what it was designed to do. The mutiny was crushed not by discipline, but by demonstration. Production of the B-26 was not halted. The Army introduced a slightly modified version with an extra 3 feet added to the wingspan to slightly reduce the landing speed, but the core geometry remained exactly the same. The pilots went back to their cockpits, strictly adhering to the mandated high air speeds. The training fatalities in Tampa Bay dropped dramatically. The B-26 Marauder had survived its own pilots and the politicians in Washington. The aircraft was declared operational and ready for combat. But understanding the mathematics of taking off in Florida was vastly different from understanding the mathematics of surviving a war in Europe. The generals had forced the pilots to accept the machine. Now they were going to deploy it. And they were going to make a catastrophic tactical error that would almost destroy the Widowmaker permanently. By the spring of 1943, the United States 8th Air Force in England was preparing to unleash the Widowmaker on Nazi-occupied Europe. The pilots of the 322nd Bombardment Group had survived the mathematical terrors of MacDill Field. They had mastered the insanely high landing speeds and the aggressive handling required to keep the heavy B-26 Marauder from falling out of the sky. But mastering the aerodynamics of an aircraft in Florida did not prepare them for the devastating tactical doctrines forced upon them by their commanders in Britain. The planners in the 8th Air Force headquarters made a fundamental, catastrophic miscalculation regarding how a twin-engine medium bomber should be utilized in heavily defended European airspace. They decided to adopt Royal Air Force tactics, specifically the dangerous art of ultra-low-level assault. The theoretical advantage of a low-level attack was surprise. The B-26 would fly across the English Channel at literally wave-top height to evade German radar detection. Upon reaching the enemy coast, the bombers would maintain an altitude of barely 100 to 300 feet above the ground. At 300 miles per hour on the deck, the attacking planes would theoretically be invisible to radar, too low for heavy anti-aircraft guns to track, and moving too fast for light flak gunners to aim. The aircraft would scream over the target, drop delayed action bombs, and disappear before the enemy knew they were there. It was a beautiful theory that completely ignored reality. The problem was that the B-26 Marauder was not a sleek, agile fighter bomber like the British Mosquito. It was a massive 34,000-pound machine with an enormous 65-foot wingspan. At an altitude of 100 feet, it was not a stealthy assassin. It was an incredibly loud, unmissable flying barn. And the European coastline was not undefended space. It was the heavily fortified Atlantic Wall, bristling with thousands of rapid-fire 20mm and 37mm anti-aircraft cannons, specifically designed to shred unarmored aircraft at point-blank range. On May 14, 1943, the 322nd Bomb Group launched their first combat mission. 12 B-26 bombers were sent to attack a power station in IJmuiden, a heavily defended coastal town in the Netherlands. The operation was a terrifying preview of the disaster to come. The bombers approached at zero altitude. The German defenders were not surprised. A massive wall of light anti-aircraft fire ripped into the formation. The sheer volume of lead in the air was unimaginable. Every single one of the 12 B-26 aircraft was heavily damaged. One bomber was so badly shot up that it crashed immediately upon trying to land back in England, killing the entire crew. Several others were essentially reduced to flying scrap metal. The attack achieved literally nothing. The power station was completely unharmed because the low-level bombing run had forced the pilots into inaccurate, panicked maneuvers to avoid flying directly into smokestacks and power lines. Any rational commander would have looked at the horrifically shot-up aircraft limping back to base, analyzed the total failure of the objective, and immediately halted low-level operations. But the generals did not halt. 3 days later, on May 17th, they ordered the 322nd Bomb Group back into the exact same blender. The target was again the generating plant at IJmuiden. 11 B-26 Marauders lifted off from England, fully loaded with fuel and bombs. One aircraft suffered an electrical failure almost immediately and was forced to abort, returning to base. The remaining 10 bombers grouped into an incredibly tight formation, dropped down to 50 feet above the dark waters of the North Sea, and headed straight back to the coast of Holland. What happened next was not a battle. It was a mathematical execution. The German defenders at IJmuiden were waiting. They knew exactly how the Americans had attacked 3 days prior, and they knew the heavy bombers had to approach through a specific geographical funnel to line up on the power station. They reinforced the coastline with additional rapid-fire Flak-38 cannons. As the 10 B-26 Marauders slammed across the Dutch beaches at 300 miles per hour, merely 100 feet above the sand dunes, their element of surprise was entirely gone. The Germans opened fire immediately at point-blank range. The B-26 had decent defensive armor plating to protect the crew from shrapnel, but armor plating is useless against direct hits from concentrated fire. The lead element of 4 bombers, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Stillman, took the brunt of the initial defensive barrage. A heavy 88mm shell, depressed to fire horizontally, slammed directly into the wing of one of the massive bombers. The heavy aircraft violently cartwheeled out of the sky and disintegrated into a fireball across the coastal fields. The remaining 3 aircraft in the lead element desperately tried to turn inward to line up their bomb run, but they were swarmed by German Focke-Wulf 190 fighter planes that had been deployed to explicitly hunt the slow-turning bombers on the deck. One by one, the heavy B-26 aircraft were ripped apart by 20mm cannon shells. Stillman's bomber took a direct hit to the cockpit and crashed violently. Stillman miraculously survived as a prisoner of war, but the rest of his crew died instantly. The trailing element of 6 aircraft watched the lead element evaporate in flames directly ahead of them. The orders of the mission dictated they press the attack, flying straight into the exact same wall of steel that had just annihilated their commander. The B-26 pilots pushed the throttles of their big radial engines forward and drove their bulky machines straight into the storm. It was absolutely futile. The rapid-fire anti-aircraft tracer rounds from the ground formed a solid, glowing net across the low-level flight path. At 100 feet of altitude, the heavy bombers had absolutely zero room to maneuver. If a pilot flinched and banked too hard to avoid a burst of fire, the wingtip of the massive aircraft clipped the ground, instantly ripping the plane apart in a catastrophic cartwheel. They had to fly straight. A 5th B-26 was hit in the engine by light flak, pouring black smoke before crashing violently into the ocean. A 6th bomber was torn apart by fighter fire. A 7th vanished in an explosion over the target zone. The geometric impossibility of the tactic played out with brutal finality. Back in England, the operations officers of the 322nd Bomb Group stood on the runway, checking the sky and their watches. The fuel limit of a B-26 was strictly defined. As the time window for the return of the 11 bombers closed, the sky remained perfectly empty. The base commander waited an extra hour, then 2 hours, hoping against hope that perhaps some aircraft had diverted to other airfields. The reality slowly settled over the airbase like a physical weight. Of the 10 B-26 Marauders that had crossed the coast of Holland that morning, exactly 0 returned. Absolutely none. The entire operation had been wiped from the sky. 60 highly trained American airmen had been completely annihilated in less than 20 minutes of combat. It was a 100% casualty rate. It was the single worst tactical disaster suffered by the medium bombers in the entire war. The slaughter at IJmuiden generated a shockwave of horror through the United States military establishment. The B-26 Marauder, the aircraft that the young pilots had mutinied against in Florida, the Widowmaker, was incredibly close to being permanently erased from the Air Force inventory. The politicians who had wanted to scrap the plane were vindicated. The aircraft, they argued, was a death trap both in training and in combat. The order was almost given to completely abandon the bomber project, tear up the manufacturing contracts, and convert the remaining airframes to scrap aluminum. But a profound mathematical analysis of the massacre saved the Widowmaker. The generals were forced to realize that the catastrophic failure of the combat mission was not a failure of aeronautical engineering. It was a failure of command doctrine. The B-26 was not a low-level raider. It was too large, physically unsuited for hedgehopping, and vastly too vulnerable at point-blank range. The commanding officers of the 9th Air Force completely tore up the tactical manual. They instituted a massive, systemic change in operations. The B-26 would never again be flown on low-level assault missions over Europe. Instead, the heavy bombers would be elevated to medium altitude, specifically between 10,000 and 15,000 feet. At this altitude, they were entirely out of range of the deadly rapid-fire light flak cannons that had annihilated them in Holland. They would adopt the strict, tight defensive box formations pioneered by the heavy B-17 flying fortresses. And critically, they would be equipped with the highly classified Norden bomb sight, allowing them to drop their payloads with mathematical precision from relative safety. This single tactical shift utterly transformed the B-26 Marauder. The flying Prostitute was about to stop being a slaughterhouse for its own crews and was about to become the single most devastating tactical weapon leading the invasion of Fortress Europe. The most famous example of this transformation was a single battered B-26 that would become a legendary piece of flying history. completely defying the grim reputation of the Widowmaker. It painted the words "Flak-Bait" on its nose and went to war. The tactical resurrection of the B-26 Marauder from the disaster of IJmuiden was absolute and total. Moved to an altitude of 12,000 feet, the aircraft suddenly found the environment it had been perfectly engineered for. At that height, the short, stubby wings allowed the massive bomber to fly at speeds exceeding 280 miles per hour. This speed made the B-26 incredibly difficult for German fighter pilots to intercept effectively. And because the aircraft was built so heavily, packed with armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks, it could statistically survive a phenomenal amount of punishment. The Marauder transitioned from a terrifying death trap to an unbreakable flying vault. No single aircraft embodied this impossible mathematical contradiction more than a specific B-26 designated bearing, the tail number 41-31773. The bomber was assigned to the 322nd Bombardment Group, the same unit that had been entirely annihilated over Holland. Its pilot, a bold young lieutenant named James Farrell from New York, recognized the grim reality of exactly what his aircraft was designed to do. He decided to embrace the danger rather than fear it. He named his brand new heavy bomber Flak-Bait. He instructed a mechanic to paint a massive, ragged red bomb on the nose, accompanied by a picture of a cartoon dog snapping at a bursting anti-aircraft shell. It was an arrogant challenge to the German gunners below. He did not know how prophetic the name would become. Operating from bases in England and eventually France, the B-26 groups became the surgical strike arm of the Allied invasion force. While the heavy, four-engine B-17S bombed massive industrial cities deep inside Germany, the twin-engine B-26s focused purely on tactical destruction. They destroyed bridges, pulverized rail yards, and systematically evaporated German communication hubs across France. They flew in tight, geometric formations of 36 or 54 aircraft, completely obliterating specific targets with an incredibly dense, concentrated storm of explosives. Flak-Bait, under the command of Farrell and a rotating cast of crews, flew directly into the heart of the storm on an almost daily basis. The aircraft seemed to possess a terrifying, almost supernatural magnetism for enemy fire. The heavy bomber rapidly became exactly what its name promised. On one mission over northern France, Flak-Bait was bracketed by heavy 88mm anti-aircraft fire. A jagged piece of hot steel shrapnel, exactly the size of a man's fist, punched directly through the plexiglass nose, instantly killing the bombardier. A second shell exploded directly beneath the right wing, violently ripping away a massive 3-foot section of the aluminum skin. The control cables for the heavy ailerons snapped violently, leaving the plane listing heavily to one side. The massive right engine sputtered, streaming a thick, highly visible trail of black oil for 50 miles across the English Channel. But Farrell wrestled the massive control yoke with both hands, using the remaining engine torque to fight the asymmetric drag, and slammed the Widowmaker down safely onto a British runway. The ground mechanics counted over 70 holes in the fuselage. A B-24 Liberator would have likely folded in half from the structural damage. The incredibly stout B-26 merely required a few days of patching, a new cable, and a replacement bombardier. By June 6, 1944, the long-awaited morning of D-Day, the B-26 Marauders were assigned a mission of absolute, critical tactical importance. They were ordered to neutralize the concrete German gun emplacements directly overlooking Utah Beach, mere minutes before the American infantry hit the sand. It was an incredibly complex mathematical problem. The bombers had to drop their 4,000-pound payloads precisely onto the seawall, without hitting the massive fleet of landing craft idling just offshore. The weather over Normandy that morning was heavily overcast. A thick solid ceiling of gray clouds hung aggressively over the invasion beaches at exactly 3,000 feet. The massive four-engine B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers operating under strict orders to avoid hitting their own troops in low visibility, were forced to drop their bombs blindly using radar through the cloud cover. Because the radar resolution was incredibly poor, the heavy bombers delayed their drops by several seconds as a safety margin. Their massive explosive payloads missed the German bunkers entirely, detonating uselessly 3 to 5 miles inland amongst empty French cow pastures. The infantry approaching Omaha Beach would pay a horrific, bloody price for that delay, landing exactly into fully intact German machine gun nests. But over Utah Beach, the B-26 Marauder groups made a vastly different, deeply calculated decision. They knew their target was critical. Understanding that dropping bombs blindly through the clouds would result in a complete tactical failure, the commanders of the medium bombers broke formation. They ordered their pilots to push the noses of their fast, heavy aircraft down into the weather. They dropped down below the cloud deck. Suddenly, they were flying at a heavily dangerous altitude of barely 2,000 feet over the Normandy coast. At that altitude, they were perfectly visible and directly within the lethal point-blank range of hundreds of German 88mm anti-aircraft guns, positioned specifically to defend the coast. The sky above Utah Beach instantly erupted into a horrifying, chaotic net of black smoke and violent explosions. Flak-Bait was perfectly centered in the leading elements. The heavy B-26 plunged into the storm of steel. Shrapnel hammered the underside of the fuselage, sounding like violent hail on a tin roof. The aircraft bucked violently from the concussive pressure waves of near misses. The airframes of the bombers were taking brutal damage, but the B-26 was built like a flying tank. Through the clear plexiglass nose, the bombardiers visually identified the concrete bunker complexes guarding the seawall. Because they were flying at medium altitude rather than 0 feet, and because they used the highly accurate Norden sights, the mathematics were perfect. At precisely the calculated moment, the payload doors opened. The B-26 formations dropped an absolute, crushing carpet of thousands of high-explosive bombs perfectly onto the German defensive positions at Utah Beach. The seawall disintegrated into a massive, rolling cloud of dust and fire. The machine gun nests were completely pulverized. 3 minutes after the bombs detonated, the first wave of American infantry hit the sand. The German resistance on Utah Beach was incredibly light compared to the slaughter at Omaha, directly due to the surgical, low-level strike of the heavy-medium bombers. Flak-Bait survived D-Day. It survived the summer offensive. It survived the Battle of the Bulge. The aircraft took an unbelievable amount of devastating punishment. Over the course of the war, mechanics applied over 1,000 distinct metal patches to the fuselage to cover shrapnel holes and direct hits. It flew back to base twice on a single engine. It flew back with its hydraulic system completely shot out, forcing the crew to land without brakes. It flew back with the pilot's instrument panel entirely blown away by a 20mm shell. By the end of the European War in 1945, the aircraft affectionately named Flak-Bait had completed an absolutely astonishing 207 combat missions. It was the highest number of combat flights achieved by any American bomber in the entirety of the Second World War. A bomber that was expected to survive perhaps a dozen flights over Germany had survived over 200. When the Air Force statisticians finally compiled the data at the end of the conflict, they uncovered a perfectly ironic mathematical reality. The specific aircraft that had initiated a full-scale pilot mutiny, the terrifying machine whose production Congress had aggressively tried to ban, the infamous Widowmaker that supposedly killed everyone who touched it, had mathematically achieved the lowest combat loss rate of any American bomber in the entire European theater of operations. The loss rate for the B-26 Marauder was officially less than 1%. It was an entirely unforgiving machine. It demanded absolute mathematical precision from the young men flying it. If a pilot made a mistake on landing speed, the airplane killed him instantly. But if an aviator respected the demanding geometry of the short wings, the heavy machine rewarded him by becoming an indestructible fortress of steel in the sky. It absorbed more physical punishment than logic dictated possible, and stubbornly dragged its crews back home. The B-26 Marauder did not start as a beloved airplane. It started as a daily funeral in Florida. But by the time the engines finally fell silent over a liberated Europe, the young men flying the terrifying Widowmaker understood the profound truth of their heavy machine. They hadn't just survived the worst aircraft in the Army Air Force. They had mastered the most unkillable bomber in the world.